It didn't happen all overnight. It was kind of like a snowball effect, right? Like over time, it just piled on and piled on and piled on. And it was like a runaway snowball of like things that became my responsibility that I picked up over the years of becoming a parent. And one day I woke up and I was like, whoa, how did we get here? And why is this all my job?
Yeah, right. Why is it all your job? Hi, welcome to the Unapologetically Yours podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Logan, and here we go deep on everything from spirituality to relationships and connection to business and belief systems. Because in a world where we've been taught to play by the rules, it's time to live unapologetically. And I am so happy to have a guest here today, Paige Connell, who is the voice of equity in marriage, the voice of equal parenting, and someone who I have had the pleasure of following on Instagram and have learned so much from. Paige, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Paige is a working mom of four. Her relatable TikTok, Instagram content resonates with literally millions. She's candid, she talks really fast, and gives great examples about the inherent bias that so many of us are carrying when it comes to balance in relationships, balance in parenting. She's also a huge advocate for affordable childcare, paid leave, reproductive rights. And Paige, tell us just a little bit about yourself and what you stand for.
Yes, I am a mom of 4 kids. I am very much still in the thick of parenting young ones. So like I feel like that colors my life right now in many ways, but I've always been a working mom. I am married. I think that's important to talk about because I think a lot of what I talk about has to do with marriage and equity. But as a person, I started to become aware of some of the things you mentioned, whether it's affordable childcare or gender inequity, lack of paid leave, all of these things as I lived them, which I think is the case for so many women, right? So when I think about myself and my journey here and why I talk about the things that I do, it's because I was essentially kind of radicalized by my experience. I went through early postpartum days with only 8 weeks of leave and was pissed, right? I was mad and I couldn't find affordable childcare and my kids sat on a wait list for 2 years and I was mad, right? And so like all of these things happened. And as I started to dive into these things, I really started to unpack all the systemic issues that play into it and better understand them. And that's really kind of where my content comes from and the work that I do is from having lived the experience first and foremost, which opened my eyes. And all of that really stemmed from being a person who is married to a man, working full time and had kids living in the US. I think that is important to say too, in case anybody's not here. It's definitely very specific to the lived experience in this country.
How old are your kids?
7.5, 6.5, 4, and 2.5. So they're younger.
Yeah, we're right in the same ballpark because my kids are 4, 6, and 8.
Okay,
And
yeah.
yeah, so but the juggling act is real. For you have a sick kid who stays home.
We had the stomach bug last week. Literally, it was like the worst week ever.
Yeah, we've got a cough going through our
Same,
house.
yeah.
Yeah, and now everyone's got it. But
Yeah.
okay, so tell me a little bit about what were some of the things that surprised you in parenthood and the impact that it had on your marriage and your relationship and some of the expectations that maybe you carried into it. And then when you were like, yeah, no way, this is not how we're going to do it.
Yeah, so I think I've started to think about it differently over time. If you'd asked me this question 2 years ago, I'd say, like, I didn't realize how much laundry there was and how it'd be all my responsibility and how unequal it was going to feel and how burnt out I was going to be. And I think that I've learned over time, like, a lot of those things are a symptom of parenting. They're not actually parenting, right? So the things that make parenting hard are like toddler tantrums and managing people's emotions and getting your kids to eat a healthy, nutritious meal and like cooking 17 dinners, right? That is the stuff of parenting that is like exhausting and the constant research and anxiety about, am I doing right by them, right? Like that stuff of parenting is hard. But what was hardest for me to navigate as a new parent were all of the things that come with parenting that have like nothing to do with the kids, right? The amount of physical labor, domestic labor that comes with kids, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, all of those things. And how even when you have a new baby, right, whether you're breastfeeding or formula, whatever, I pumped, how much work that is and how time consuming that is and how it disproportionately falls to women. So the hardest things about parenting for me were the systems I was parenting within, right? The fact that we have this kind of setup where men are told their job is to go to work and, like, yeah, they come home and help out sometimes, but really the kids are your mom's responsibility. And even when you have the most hands-on partner, oftentimes these inequities happen where mom is doing the bulk of the chores and the bulk of the childcare, even when she's working full time. And so that was the hardest part for me becoming a parent. Was it didn't happen all overnight. It was kind of like a snowball effect, right? Like over time, it just piled on and piled on and piled on. And it was like a runaway snowball of like things that became my responsibility that I picked up over the years of becoming a parent. And one day I woke up and I was like, whoa, how did we get here? And why is this all my job?
Yeah, right. Why is it all your job? And I guess it's funny. Like I reflect back on like my early days of parenting, and I was breastfeeding, and I had some friends who would wake up their husbands to change the diaper after
Mhm.
breastfeeding, and I was like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me because I'm already awake and I can just go ahead and do it. So like I kind of built this hero complex. So I'm like, I got it. I
Mm,
can do it. I can do the things. And especially I think when it comes to like infants, and but where it started to be, where I started to feel the overwhelm was then like with kid number 2 and then kid number
mm.
3. And then when I have a newborn, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and all of those people who need me for the things that I could provide as mom, but then the other parts of it that were, the mental load. So
Yeah.
pause for a second, like what is the mental load?
Yeah. So the way I think about the mental load, the way I like to describe it is a running to-do list in your brain of all the things you need to know, do, and remember. Right. So maybe it's the fact that you know that when you make oatmeal for breakfast, one kid likes honey, one kid likes brown sugar, the other likes it plain. You know that. It's in your brain. It lives in your brain rent free. And you know that. And you know that about every food. This kid likes cheddar. This kid likes mozzarella, whatever, right? There's things you know and you need to remember. There's things you need to do. I need to sign my son up for soccer practice. I need to launder his soccer uniform for the game. I need to, do all these things. And oh, actually, after I did the laundry, I realized we need Tide Pods. And so, like, add it to the grocery list. It's this running checklist that's in your brain of all the things you need to know, do, and remember all of the time. And the thing about this running checklist is that it never gets shorter. Every time you check something off, you add new things to the list. So, like the laundry, for example, you've done the laundry, but in doing the laundry, you realize your son has blown through the knee on 4 of his pants. And so now he needs new pants. And not only does he need new pants, you realize he also needs, pants for soccer. And so let's add those two things to the list. And so it's that to-do list, or some people like to call it like the open tab on your computer, like all the open tabs you keep so you don't forget about them. That's how I think about it. And the mental load is often this like invisible work we're doing. And it goes along with any task we have. When you're cooking dinner, for example, you're thinking about, okay, what meat is going to expire first? What goes well with that meat? What vegetables is my kid actually going to eat today or not eat? Have they had enough protein? Do we need more ketchup? Add it to the grocery list. It's all of these running things that are always going through your brain as you're moving about life and doing tasks. You're also keeping this mental checklist. And so some people call it cognitive labor as well, like the work we're doing, because it is work at the end of the day. And it can be really exhausting because as a mother in particular, you'll see like the trending hashtag, the mental load of motherhood. Motherhood just brings so much mental work and things to know and to do and remember and to be responsible for. And so I think when we talk about the mental load, we often associate it with mothers. It's not exclusive to mothers. You have mental load in every relationship. You have it at work, you have it with friends. It exists in all different like facets of life. It's just incredibly heavy as a mother oftentimes.
Sure. So here you are, a mom of 4 kids, and you wake up one day and you're like, what the fuck? This
Yeah.
is, oh, how did I get here? And so what did that conversation with your partner look like? And what did you realize that could come off your plate? Tell me about the process, and lots of
Yeah.
questions there. So let's start with
Yeah.
that.
So I think there's a few things that compounded my specific circumstances, which maybe you relate to because it sounds like we had similar timing. But my husband and I became foster parents in the middle of 2019. So 6 months later was a global pandemic and I was pregnant by that time. And so we went from no kids to 3 kids in about a year. And it was also a pandemic. So we lost our childcare. I became a work from home mom who also watched the children. All of that happened very, very quickly. So we went from no kids to 3 kids and an incredibly different environment than we had anticipated, right? It was very difficult to find childcare. Our daycare closed down for 4 months. I worked from home, which I'd never done before. So everything had really, as I became a mother, my world also flipped upside down, as did everyone else's. But that was my first year as a mom. So it was quite a drastic experience. And so I think,
My God. Can we just like
yeah.
have a moment of silence for Paige? Oh my God. 'Cause, I mean, that's a lot. My third was born in May 2020. And so like we all know what that experience was like.
Brutal.
And but then like that massive adjustment
Yeah.
plunged into parenting under those circumstances. Holy shit.
Yeah. Yeah, and we ended up having our fourth in 2022. So we went, yeah, from no kids to four kids in about 3.5 years. And you know, I think all of this would have happened. I just think it would have taken a longer time for me to reach a breaking point had it not been a global pandemic. I think no matter what, we would have gotten to this point. But I think because of that, it kind of expedited the process because of the dynamic. My husband was still working outside of the home because he's a first responder. And so we had just like vastly different expectations placed on us. And it very quickly became my responsibility to be like the physical presence with the children, taking on domestic labor because I was working from home, like all of these things. And, you know, I've said this before, but my husband is a very present and hands-on dad. Like my husband was not one of those guys who like kicks up his feet in the chair and drinks a beer at dinner time, right? Like he's right next to me, feeding the kids, getting them what they need, cuddling the toddler who's mad, right? Like he's doing all of those things. My husband has always been very present and very hands-on. Like that's never been an issue. And I think that's the case for so many women, which is like zoom out, it looks like you have this like really amazing partner who's super hands-on and super involved. But then there's that mental load layer and the invisible labor layer, which we haven't said invisible labor out loud, but it's just kind of all of that work that's happening in the background that often is unacknowledged or dismissed or underappreciated or undervalued, right? And so for me, that might have looked like the fact that I was making kids lunches every single day. I was the person who made sure that they had diapers and wipes. I was the person who made sure they had extra clothes at school. I was the person who was folding the laundry and washing the sheets. And all of these things were happening in the background. And my partner goes to work every single day. So he doesn't see them. So it's like they don't happen. It's like they're not real. The work doesn't exist. And
It just
yeah,
shows up. It
it
gets
just shows
done.
up. Exactly. And like that's the case for a lot of people. That's invisible labor is something they benefit from, but they aren't accountable or responsible for it. And so they don't see the work that goes into it oftentimes, and or they just don't value that work. And for me, what happened was having children put this burden on me where I had always been kind of the like project manager of our home. Like I had always been that anyways. But with kids, I even more so became that, right? It was my job to figure out the sleep schedule. And it was my job to figure out like how much we were feeding them and when, and are we doing baby led weaning or not? And I was doing all of this. And we were having these conversations, right? I would come to my partner and say, like, I'm burnt out, I'm stressed, I need you to do more. And he would say, like, I don't know what you want me, like, I'm here, I'm always with you. Like, what else do you want from me? And I'm like, we would talk in circles. We would talk in circles because I would tell him I need to do more. He would get defensive and feel like shame because he's like, I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do. Like, I'm doing way more than other dads. Like, what are you talking about? And it didn't really click for us until we kind of had the words and the terminology to say things like the mental load, or the fact that I was able to express that I was feeling resentful, that I was responsible for all these things, and or like I was the safety net for everybody. I was the catch-all. Like if he forgot to do something, it always fell to me, and it was my responsibility to do it. And I didn't have a safety net in any of these things. Being able to have these conversations, talk about invisible labor, that was like a turning point. But specifically, when we were able to break away from that like circle fight where it's just like we're fighting about the dishwasher, but it's not actually about the dishwasher, was
I
when
want to do the dishes.
Yes, exactly. The breakup. Exactly. It's that. We would fight about these things, right? And it would seem like a silly thing to fight about. Or like people joke, like, oh, my wife divorced me over the dishes in the sink. And it's like, well, it's not about the dishes, right? It's not. It's about everything that like it stands for. The way we view men's time versus women's time, the way we view the labor, the unpaid, invisible labor women are doing versus the paid labor men typically are told is more important, right? Even though women are oftentimes doing paid labor as well. So the real like catalyst for change for us was I had read the book Fair Play by Eve Rodsky, and that kind of gave us the jumping off point to have an actual constructive conversation. And so if you're not familiar with Eve, her book is great, and it kind of walks you through the inequities that often exist in a household between a man and a woman, but also between all different kinds of relationships. And she gives you a tool, a game essentially, to kind of try to find equity. And we did this. I turned it into a spreadsheet because the card game doesn't make sense in my brain. But when we did this, we divvied up these tasks. There's 100 tasks. You're not supposed to use all of them. But when we did it, I think I had like 60 something and he had like 15 tasks. And we looked at it on paper and I was like, yeah, does this feel fair? Can you see why I'm burnt out? Can you see why I'm asking for more? I need more. Like this is I'm burning out. And that really was the like eye opener for both of us to have a more constructive conversation about what equity would look like in our home and how we were going to achieve it.
Yeah. And first, two questions. One, have you made that spreadsheet available to other people? Because
Yeah, it's always linked in my bio, but I can also give it to you. Yes, it is fair play turned into a spreadsheet. I did not create the game. You can adjust it, change it however you want. But yes, the spreadsheet is available. I will give you the link. I find it incredibly helpful.
sure. Thank you for that. I will share
Yeah.
that in the show notes. And so, what would the road have looked like had you not done this?
Divorce, probably, transparently. I mean, I felt really at that time disrespected, like as if my time was not nearly as important or valuable, as if my contributions were not as important or valuable. And the funny thing is, like, again, prior to kids, this is what you'll often hear is like, prior to kids, we were great. Prior to kids, everything was super equal. Prior to kids, he like loved that I was a career woman. Prior to kids is so different than kids. And things oftentimes aren't actually equitable when you look at prior to kids. Like if you really put it on paper, you're like, okay, it didn't feel super unfair because there was no like dependents who needed you to
Right.
participate. But
People
if we were
counting on you to stay alive. Yeah.
yeah,
Parents feel a
exactly.
different weight than like your date nights.
Exactly. Or even like taking the dog for a walk. It's like, okay, like, yes, we need to do our fair share here, but it just doesn't feel as drastic oftentimes, but it usually exists the inequities between men and women in a relationship. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was like he was always a huge champion of my career. He was always a huge champion of me going after what I wanted. And he used to jokingly say, like, I'm going to be a stay at home dad. And then we had kids and he was like, no way, I can't be a stay at home dad. And which is what a lot of moms feel too. We're like, no, this is a lot. Like, I can't be a stay at home mom. And so, like, going into parenthood, I could have never expected it to be like this. And then when we got there, I got to this point where I was so resentful and so frustrated that if it hadn't changed, I don't think I could have continued in that way. I just couldn't have done it. I was so burnt out and lonely, feeling like I was the only person, like, truly accountable to these things.
That resonates a lot. Like loneliness when you're, and it's hard to articulate some of those things. It's hard to articulate the weight of it. It's hard to articulate what it's like laying up at night and thinking about like, am I doing a good enough job with
Yeah.
the kids and how that, but the responsibility of their outcomes falling solely on one partner or the other. Like even the example that you gave about like baby led weaning, so many dads will be like, I don't know, fucking know, that's up to you.
Who
And
cares? Yeah.
who
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 cares?
you or sleep training or all of that. Like, why do I care about sleep training? You're the one who gets up anyway. It's like,
Hmm.
um, it's one of those things that I think is really prevalent in relationships. And we're going to come back to why. But so tell me a little bit about now you started creating content and to help educate people. What has that process been like for you?
Sure. So it's only been about 2 years since I started creating content, and I started out on TikTok not with any intention in mind. Like I really didn't. We used TikTok at work for advertising. Like if we had a viral video, then our sales would go up, and it was like good marketing, good brand awareness. And I just figured I'd been a lurker, but I was like, oh, I'll try posting, learn about this app. It'll be fun. And so it was just meant to be fun. And I was really sharing my perspective as a working mom at this point. And we probably were like 3 or 4 months into my husband and I's journey to kind of like navigate this change in our relationship. But I really was not talking about it. And I had no intentions to talk about it online. Like my first video was about the cutoff. I don't know if you're not a parent, you're maybe not familiar, but like if your kid's born after a certain day, then they have to wait a whole extra year to go to school. So like I made a video about the cutoff and how because of the cutoff, I was going to spend an extra $20,000 a year on my daughter's daycare because she couldn't go to school right when she turned 5. That was like my first video. So for context, like I had no like real intention other than to have fun and learn about this app. And it was TikTok. But then as I started to share my experience, I started to hear from other women who were like, wait, can you talk more about childcare costs? Or can you talk more about like how you navigate X, Y, and Z as a parent? Or to your point, the research part. Like I made a video once about how there's a really big difference between like an informed parenting decision by a person who's done a lot of research and talked to the kid's pediatrician and like an opinionated decision. And your opinion doesn't trump like information. Just because you don't think that a lollipop's a choking hazard doesn't mean it's not a choking hazard, right? Like, so I started to talk about these things that were all like semi tied to this idea of the mental load and domestic labor and the inequities between men and women. And so I just started to kind of post about that. And as I did, I found that more and more women were like, oh my gosh, I've never been able to articulate this. Can you help talk about this part of it or this part of it? And so it really just became a tool to help other women have the words to express what they were going through. Because when I didn't, I felt incredibly lonely and frustrated. And I felt like there was no way to change anything because I couldn't even say what was happening in a way that was productive. And so that's really how it started. It's obviously evolved greatly since then, but that's really just kind of how it happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you did, because I think that it's important in the way that you use data, your own personal experience, and you're so relatable. It's shifted my perspective and been a great tool for me to be able to re-articulate some of the things that I've experienced too. And so I'm curious too. So you have you're a persona now. And with that, sometimes invites in the trolls and
Mm,
people who are in adamant disagreement that you are absolutely wrong about the things that you are actually an expert in.
hmm.
And so I'm curious about how one recent example is there was an former or current NFL player who
Oh,
shared.
God. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This was the situation where I was like, I need to talk to Paige. So to give a quick recap, his wife had just given birth via C-section, and he went on his podcast to talk about what an A-plus dad he was and how he changed, 16 diapers in 3 days, which is like not even half of the amount of diapers that a newborn needs, and made meals and all of these things.
Mhm,
And who, as a content creator, naturally made a stitch to talk about this perspective. And
mhm.
or maybe his podcast was in jest, and you also are, allowed to reply with satire. But the amount of bros who came after you about your perspective was really astonishing. And
Mm.
one, I'm glad that it hasn't impacted you and you're still going and creating, but I imagine that it impacted you in terms of how you felt and your safety and some of the things that they were saying.
Yeah, so it's interesting, as a person who creates content about equity and gender and talks a lot about how men can probably do better, I get my fair share of trolling from men. I go into any one of my videos, you're going to see hundreds to thousands of comments from angry men. And I'm super used to it. And to be honest, like I just like don't really go in my comment section because I'm like I just can't even bother to engage with this, right? So I'm very used to this. I've ended up on Matt Walsh's Twitter feed. Like I have received the hate from men and I'm like totally fine with it. It's like a something I know is going to come from this conversation because it's a triggering conversation for a lot of men. That one instance was interesting because it was the first time where I got an influx of DMs as opposed to comments. And I thought that was really interesting. And so, like, when they come into your DM, it's just a bit more personal, right? It's less public, it's more targeted. It can usually be more hurtful because they're not saying it in a public platform. So, like, people will say heinous things in a comment. And then they get really mad when I like screenshot it and share it in my stories. And I'm like, I don't know, you said it online. You put your name here. Like, maybe don't say these things. But when people do it in a DM, it definitely feels different, right? So I had like thousands of DMs from men telling me that I was an awful person and like saying violent things and harmful things. But the most interesting thing to me about it was like, yes, it's not fun to receive that. It's not fun to open up your phone and see thousands of men telling you they hate you. But it wasn't surprising to me. What was surprising to me was how much they went to bat for this man that they idolize. He's an ex football player who claims to be this like really amazing dad. And he wears this hat that says girl dad. And a lot of them were coming into my thing like, you clearly don't know him. He's such a good dad. Like, if you knew him and you knew his content, he's a good person. And like, they really wanted me to know he was a good dad. And so then I would say, well, what makes him a good dad? They're like, well, he loves his daughter. I'm like, okay, like that's bare minimum. Like, well, I should hope so, right? Like he loves his kid. So what else makes him a good dad? Like, why? And they'd be like, he set such a good example for us as men about what it looks like to be a good dad. And I was like, well, I don't know. Like if I think about a good person, they typically don't rip other people apart on the internet because he had done a few different videos of me and like whatever. And they'd be like, "Yeah, he shouldn't have done that, but, like, he's still a good dad." And I was like, "Okay, but, like, tell me why. Tell me why he's a good dad. Tell me, like, what is he doing? Is he doing the overnight feedings? Is he doing what is he doing?" Right? And nothing, right? Crickets. And so I think it was just a reminder to me that what is considered a good dad is so much different than what's considered a good mom. And I already know this to be true, but it was just another, like, example of what that looks like and how a man saying, "I love my daughter," it makes him a good dad. But every mom I know says, "I love my kids. I love my kids." And that's not enough to be considered a good mom. That's not even important to people. It's like, you love your kids, yeah, but what else are you doing? Are you feeding them organic meals? Are you home cooking every single meal? Are you like doing all of the things that society expects of you? Because if not, then you're not a good mom, right? So
You're on the phone and your phone at the park.
right. Right. And
You're
it's like
what,
dad
doing
brings home pizza for dinner. He's a fun dad. Mom brings home pizza for dinner. She's a bad mom. Right. So it's like this double standard that we're all very aware of, or at least women are very aware of. But it was just kind of a reminder of like how deeply ingrained it is, including in men, where they're like, that guy is like what it looks like to be a good dad. And I was like, he just made a video. They also kept saying, "Oh, you'd know that he knows he doesn't do it as much as his wife does, which is why he makes these funny videos calling out his stats because he like knows he doesn't do nearly as much as she does." And I was like, well, that's still not funny. It's not funny to make fun of the fact that you don't do as much as your partner. Like, that's not funny to me. Right. So, like, all of it feels contradictory. Weirdly, I gained a few followers from these people after engaging with them in DMs, but yeah, a handful, because there was also a lot of women in my DMs, and I was like, "Hey, girl, like, let's chat for a second because, like, this is crazy." But yeah, it was just another reminder of how we view men and women so very differently in society, and we hold them just very differently when it comes to accountabilities, especially as parents.
Yes. So this to me though, it brings up a lot of different things. Like one, think about like you're you're educating people. You're changing mindset not just for men but for women as well.
Mm,
Because some of these things like there's many women who are like this is just my responsibility and this is what
yeah.
I'm supposed to do and this is what life is going to be like and I'm just going to
Hmm.
operate from this place of absolute total burnout,
Yep.
putting myself and my life on the back burner and but then you're also educating men to do things a little bit differently. But I
Hmm.
think about those inherent gender roles that we have in our culture, and I look at so many moms, and even myself included. I was headed well down this path where it's like, okay, you schedule the kids, you do all the things, you work full time, then you're driving the kids to their travel soccer, and that's 5 days a
Right.
week. By the time you get home, you have no time for
Yep.
yourself. Your health suffers and there's no downtime. And then your husband goes and plays golf for, 6 hours on a Saturday and you're still responsible for all of the things. So,
Yeah.
um, it's a lot. And
Hmm.
I think that it's really an epidemic and it's actually been proven. It's the burnout is a major problem in women. And
Hmm.
so how surprised have you been about like educating women on this and their
Yeah.
willingness like to recognize their own inherent learned behavior that led them to this place.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I had to unlearn a lot of this too, right? This idea, even I talk a lot about the cost of childcare. And it's interesting because, again, when we think about children, we often place the burden on women. So we say, hey, Paige, does your salary alone cover the cost of childcare? Because if not, you have to be a stay at home mom. And my perspective on that is no. If your shared income, your partner's income, your income together do not cover the cost of childcare, then you need to figure out a different solution. But it is not just your burden, right? It's not just yours. In the same way, a mortgage is not just the responsibility of the man. We don't go to a mortgage lender and say, "Hey, here's my husband's salary. Don't actually look at mine. It doesn't matter." No, we do it together. And that's the same way we should view childcare, right? But because for so long we've placed the burden of children and childcare and all the work that comes with that on women, it's really hard to kind of break out of this. And I even had the same struggles. And so, yeah, I mean, it's interesting when I have these conversations with other women, it's often like little things where they're like, ah, you're right. Like, this doesn't have to be just me doing this thing. It doesn't just, it's actually to your point. It's okay if my husband wakes up to change the baby's diaper so I can get back to sleep faster. And actually, you know what? Yeah, my husband should feed the baby overnight sometimes if I'm pumping because I deserve sleep too. All of these things, having these conversations can help us navigate all of this learned behavior and expectations because we've been told as women, I don't know if you relate to this, but as women, I think so many of us were told what it meant to be a mother, right? From a very young age. I remember people used to jokingly be like, oh, you're going to be such a great babysitter. And then you're going to be such a great mom someday. You're so good with the kids. Like, you're so responsible. And people don't often say that to boys, right? They don't say, oh, you're going to be such a good dad when you're older. Do you want to be a babysitter? How many kids do you want? They don't ask 10-year-old boys how many kids they want, but they'll ask little girls, oh, do you want to be a mommy when you're older? How many kids are you going to have? We place this like expectation on women that they should want to do this, that this is the ultimate job. It's the most important job that they're going to do. And so therefore, when we get there, we're putting all our eggs in that basket. We're like, okay, we have to do this well. When in reality, it's a two-person job. Like, we are both parents. And whether or not you're a stay-at-home mom and your partner works outside the house, or if you both work outside of the house, I don't think parenting is something that any one person should be opting out of or doing alone when they have a partner. Obviously, like, there's certain circumstances where we don't have those supports, but I think if you are married and or partnered with somebody, there's no reason that you should be burdened with all of this by yourself.
Well, I agree with you completely. And I love because you posted recently about this. And I've had many, many friends who opted out of the workplace who were maybe teachers whose salary
Mm,
didn't cover the costs of daycare
yeah.
or barely did. And
Yeah.
then thinking about the opportunity costs for them over the course of time. Like, so taking that 5, 6 year break, that
Yep.
is, and you shared your earning potential too, that like earlier on, then like how that would have crippled your career had you taken a back seat at that time, because we don't just make the same amount of money when we're starting our careers or starting our families. We get raised, ideally you get raises and get more responsibility and have new opportunities that come up along the way. So viewing this only as the female problem is one of those things that like I had probably repeated
Mm,
before. Like, oh, she stayed home because it didn't cost the cost of didn't cover the cost of childcare. Like, that was logical. But then when you reframed it to be like, actually, no, it's joint expenses. It's two people's kids. It should be theirs, but two people's careers, two people's lives. It should be looked at a pool. I was like, of course it should. Of
yeah.
course.
Well, and these inequities that exist in our homes, right? The way we think about this as a woman's issue versus man's issue, like the cost of childcare oftentimes is something that like women have to solve for. Like, we don't ask men to solve for that, but we ask women to solve for it, whether by leaving the workforce or whatever it is. But these inequities also bleed into the workforce, right? So it's why we have things like the motherhood penalty. It's probably why we still don't have paid leave in a meaningful way in this country, because we've just said, hey, sorry, women have to figure this out. And at the end of the day, this is not an individual issue. It's not even a woman's issue, right? This is an economic issue. This is a societal issue. This is an issue everyone should care about. But what happens is, right, when you leave the workforce, say you all decide it can't work with both of you in the workforce. So say you decide to leave the workforce. What people often ignore is, one, obviously you're not just missing out on your salary and your career advancement, which you are, but things like retirement. Women often have gaps in their career and they put less money into retirement. So they retire later in life than their male counterparts. They have less opportunity for career advancements. They have less financial security in their relationships and just in general, if God forbid anything happened to their partners, right? And then, should they choose to re enter the workforce, it's actually incredibly difficult, not just because our society doesn't value women's time at home at all. Like, they don't value the work that happens in the home. So when they come back into the workforce, they're basically like, hey, you start back at zero. It's like you've just graduated college. Welcome back to the workforce. Your pay is going to reflect it, and you're going to have no seniority in this workplace for the things you need, like flexibility. You go back to the workforce when your kids enter typically kindergarten, when there's quote unquote no more childcare costs. It's actually incredibly difficult because if you have public school age kids, then there's a million half days and no school days and vacation days and summer break, which makes it so incredibly difficult to navigate as a full-time working person. And most women go, okay, I'm going to go back to work. And then they try and they're like, I can't. I actually can't, because no one can accommodate the amount of PTO I need for my kids. Nobody can accommodate the pickup schedules for my kids. So I actually can't go back to work, even though I want to.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, and the economic implications of that countrywide are pretty
Mm-hmm.
vastly significant. So here's my question for you. What would you say are 3 behaviors that women can examine within themselves? I guess I'm putting the responsibility on the women as the wayfinder to start to have these conversations. But what are 3 behaviors that we can look at as mothers that would start to shift that balance to more of an equal partnership?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if there's specific behaviors, but I think it's like recognizing patterns and like maybe how you show up. I think you referenced one earlier, which is like the hero complex or the martyrdom of motherhood, right? Like you don't need to be a martyr for this cause. You don't have to suffer to be a mother. Like you can thrive in motherhood and you should have a partner who is supportive of that, right? So there's that. I think something we often do, which of course we do, right, is like we internalize a lot of mom guilt and shame and judgment because it comes at us like crazy, right? Like no
Right.
matter what you choose to do.
Double standard
Yeah.
of like, and the shame, like, if you ask for help, are you not enough? And
Yeah.
society tells us every day we're not enough if we're asking for
Yeah.
help.
And it's not even just asking for help, right? It's something as silly as if I drop off my daughter and her hair wasn't brushed, I will be judged for that. But if my husband did that, he would not be judged for that. They'd be like, oh, he's dad. Of course he doesn't brush her hair, even though my husband always brushes my kids' hair. But like, that's the difference, right? Like, so we walk through life with a lot of guilt and shame and judgment. I don't like to tell women, like, let go of that because that's hard to do. Like, it's so hard to move through life and having everybody telling you all the things you're doing wrong all the time and not feel guilt and frustration by that, right? Like, that's hard. But I think as much as you can feel really secure in the decisions you're making for your children and knowing that they're well taken care of and healthy and all those things, that's like the best thing you can do. But I think the other behavior, it's maybe not a behavior we have to let go of, but something we need to do more is advocate for ourselves. It sounds crazy to have to advocate for yourself with your partner. A lot of times people will come into my comments and say like, dump his ass, right? Not for me, but like if I'm talking about another woman or whatever, dump his ass, leave him, divorce him. And sometimes, yes, absolutely. Like sometimes, yes, divorce him, leave him, dump his ass, whatever. A lot of times we've been conditioned, both men and women, to show up this way, right? Men have been told their whole lives what it looks like to be a good dad and a good partner. And a lot of that is providing financially, being a quote unquote protector. And they view that as one of the most important things they can do for their family. Whereas women have been told it's our job to be the martyr as the mother, to give of ourselves to everyone else, including our partners. We've been told that like doing the laundry for our husband is showing him how we love him, when in reality, laundry has nothing to do with love, right? So we've been told these things. And so when I say advocate for yourself, I think the thing is when your eyes have been open to these issues, now we have to speak up for ourselves. Now that we're aware of it, we need to make sure our partner is aware of it. And what I always tell women is if you advocate for yourself and your partner hears you and is willing to change and able to change and values your happiness, these things are possible. If you advocate for yourself and your partner does not do those things, then that's telling of kind of where they're at, and it will help you decide kind of your path forward. But we need to say these things out loud, not just to our partners, but to each other, to educate one another, to be more open about the experience of motherhood, the experience of marriage, the experience of being a working mom. Like we need to be so much more vocal about this because I don't know how you feel, but like I felt pretty blindsided by a lot of this. And then when I would bring it up to people, they'd say things like, oh, yeah, that's just how it is. And I was
Yeah,
like,
you
what?
asked for this. Like, well, you're the one who had 3 kids in such a short period of time.
Yeah.
So what did you expect? It's like, I don't
Yeah,
know,
exactly.
something. Like
Yeah,
maybe,
something, anything. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
But the standards for men and women are so vastly different.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so how then do we start to shift the conversation around men? Because I think that I notice, and what's clear based on your comment section and the reaction to it is that there's a lot of shame that men feel around this topic. And part of that is just, where we are sort of as a society, like
Yeah.
feedback is not something that we've been conditioned to receive well. And so as we think about like how to engage men in this conversation, I guess I keep falling back on how many women I know who are just absolutely burnt out. So how do we shift the responsibility then to the men? How do we get them involved in productive conversations in a way that doesn't incite shame or defensive behavior or, just big fights, that circle that you were talking about at the beginning?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's a couple things I suggest. But first and foremost, like I think the shame and defensiveness like makes sense because nobody likes, to your point, no one likes to hear that they're not doing enough. None of us want to hear that. And so like there's that. And that's okay. It's what you do after you feel that, right? Like how you process that shame and defensiveness and how you show up after that is what's important, right? Because I remember my husband used to say like, when you tell me these things, it just makes me feel like you think I'm a bad dad. And I'm like, I've never said you're a bad dad. I'm saying I'm drowning in housework and stuff for the kids and I need help. I didn't come at you and say you're a shitty dad. You're hearing something I'm not saying. Right. But I think that is often like that's the case in any time we get feedback. We're hearing our internalized fears or like reaction to that feedback. And so then the conversation is, okay, well, where do we go from here? How do we proceed from here? I think if you're looking for like super tactical things to do, though, there's a bunch of like, there's Fair Play, there's a bunch of different apps, there's all these different ways to what I like to call make the invisible labor visible. So, like, make the mental load visible, make the invisible labor visible. So, whether it's for 2 weeks, you write down every single mental load thing that pops into your brain and every single thing that you do in the house and make a long, long list of every single thing that's happened in the home, and your partner does the same. And you come together and you talk about how to manage it better. Fair Play is a little bit more structured than that. There's also apps to help you do this because there's also cognitive labor, like to your point, like researching the best way to feed a child, researching your kid's allergies, researching whatever, the right developmental milestones for a 8-month-old baby, right? There's a lot of work too that we do there. Make that invisible labor as visible as possible in a way that feels constructive. So, like, don't come to your partner and be like, watch this invisible labor I'm doing. Yeah. Yeah.
Like you're like, yeah, throwing daggers at them.
Yeah, you want to do this in a way that's constructive. So, like, I always suggest like not doing it in the heat of the moment because you're just going to fight. Coming to your partner and saying, "Hey, it doesn't feel like either of us are thriving right now. It doesn't feel like we're operating as well as we could be as a family in a home." And you can really think about your home as like a business. And I want you to be thriving. I want to be thriving. I want us to work towards that together. And this is how I think we can do that. And if your partner's receptive to it, then you proceed forward. And then once you've made the invisible labor visible and all of that labor visible, you can start to kind of divvy it up, right? And like figure out what equity looks like for your home. And I say equity because it's never going to be equal because our work schedules and our kids' lives, everything is always changing and evolving. And like it will never be 50-50 all the time. It just can't be as much as we wish it could. So you're just trying to make it fair. And when I say dividing things up equitably, I also mean our time. So I've talked about this a lot, but there's a leisure gap between men and women. Men have more time for rest and relaxation. There is a fitness gap for men and women where men have more time to work out and work on their fitness and women don't. And all of these things lead to women and their health suffering overall. And it's because they're doing disproportionately more work when it comes to kids in the house. And when we talk about equity, I don't want you just to look at the tasks and be like, okay, the tasks seem fair. We're good. Now let's look at our time. Let's do the next step, which is like, let's look at this calendar. Let's like actually like put down on paper how many hours you're spending on this, how many hours I'm spending on this. And that might seem like a little bit too like tit for tat, but like you're going to find that oftentimes dad has like a significant amount of time for himself, whether it's for golf on Saturday or whatever it is, and mom has little to no time for herself. And we want to repair that as well.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So, what would you say for the men listeners out here, if they were wanting to look inward, what would be a couple of signs that maybe things are off balance in their households?
I think every house is different. So I will say that. But I would say it's typically off balance if your partner is having to delegate things to you all the time or write you lists or tell you how to do things because you live in that house too and you should know how to do those things. It's probably off balance if you feel like your partner is really unhappy all the time or resentful towards you or you're always fighting about things that don't seem to matter, like the dishwasher or the trash or whatever it might be. That's probably a fight that is stemming from the fact that you're maybe not doing your fair share with things. So I think that's really important. But like, I really think at the end of the day, the reason we're stuck in these like awful patterns is because we don't talk about it. And so if you're concerned about this, if you're a man and you're concerned that this is happening in your home, have the conversation with your partner. Don't wait for your partner to come to you and tell you that they're at a breaking point. Right? Like if you care enough about your partner's well-being and their health and their happiness, you'll be able to recognize when they're burnt out. Like you'll be able to see that in them. And if you can't, then that's probably a bigger issue. But like you should be able to see when your partner is burnt out, stressed out, anxious, whatever it is. You can be proactive about trying to find solutions for that. You can be the one doing the research on what is domestic labor. How do we have an equitable? You can read the books. You can listen to the podcast. Like you can do all those things. Do not wait for your partner to come to you and say, if you don't change, I gotta leave. Like, do the work on your own because it's not her job at the end of the day to force you to change. And it shouldn't be, right? Like, we should want our partners to be happy.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine that the outcomes of this, of a more balanced home life, probably means more sex, probably means a lot, just a happier household. And
Yeah.
the benefits would far exceed, any fear around the conversation.
Yeah, I think honestly, like at the end of the day, when people can strive for equity and both for time and labor, everybody's happier. Everybody's happier. The home thrives. It's more efficient. Things are just better overall because, like, It's not fun to live in a house with someone who resents you. And it's not fun to live in a house with somebody who's defensive, right? Like nobody's having fun. And that's not why we married each other, because we love each other and appreciate each other and find joy from each other's company. And so we should want that. And if this helps you get there, which it usually does, like then it's worth doing.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Thank you so much. Okay, one more question for you.
Sure.
What are you doing to show up in your life unapologetically?
Ugh, that's a hard one. I mean, because I think it's so funny. My online persona is probably pretty unapologetic. Like in my content, I am not afraid to say how I feel or what I'm thinking or how I think we can fight back up against some of these systemic issues. In my day to day life, I'm a bit of a people pleaser and I'm working on that. And so I would say like that's a work in progress for me, is kind of doing that in a meaningful way in my day to day life and not prioritizing everybody else's happiness over my own, which can be really hard, or like worrying about their perception of me. Again, as a person on the internet, it's surprising to hear, but I am very much worried about people's perception of me, specifically people I actually know. Like, I don't care what the millions of people on the internet think, but like, if you're my neighbor, I definitely do. And I'm working on that. And so, like, I want to be doing more of that and to show up a little bit more unapologetically as myself in my day to day life, in my actual community.
Yeah. Well, that's hard. I am a people pleaser in recovery, and
Yeah.
so I fully understand this. And ultimately, I think that the steps that you're taking right now about speaking your voice and giving people tools to have those tough conversations, you're making a huge difference. I know that
Oh,
you
thank you.
impacted my life, and it's been really a joy having you here today. I'm so grateful. So if you guys loved hearing from Paige, be sure to follow her on social. You can find her at She Is a Page Turner, and you
Yes.
can dive deeper into her work at she'isapageturner.com and subscribe to her Substack, and then go defend her in the comment section from any trolls who are trying to hold back progress when it comes to gender and marriage equity.
Yes, thank you.
You. And if you haven't already, follow me on Instagram at Ashley D. Logan. Subscribe and download wherever you listen to podcasts. Email us at podcast@unapologetically yours. Any comments, ideas, things that you want to hear. And now go out and make some mischief in the world. And until then, I'm Ashley Logan, and I'm unapologetically yours.